So that's a good thing if people will finally realize that I'm not actually retiring.
George Strait has always carried himself with a kind of quiet strength, the same steady presence that turned him into a legend, long before anyone called him the king of country. For decades, fans have watched him walk on stage with that familiar, calm confidence. The kind that made you believe he'd always be there, guitar in hand, ready to sing the stories that shaped an entire generation. But recently, something happened that no one expected, something that felt different, heavier and far more human than the polished image people are used to seeing. It didn't come from some dramatic headline or staged moment. It came from reality, raw, unscripted, and impossible to ignore. During a recent show, right in the middle of a song that already carried emotional weight, George paused. Not the usual kind of pause performers take to talk to the crowd, but the kind that makes thousands of people suddenly go quiet because they can sense something real is coming. And when he finally spoke, fans felt it instantly. His voice wasn't shaky, it was honest, true. Almost like he was letting them into a part of his life he rarely shares. A confession that would leave the entire arena in tears. What made that instant so powerful wasn't just the silence that washed over the arena. It was the way George stood there, almost as if the weight of everything he'd carried for years finally surfaced all at once. Because as soon as he paused, people felt a shift. Moments earlier, he was the same George they'd watched for more than 40 years, steady, confident, commanding the crowd with just a look. But now, that steady presence softened, and the man behind the music began to show through. And that's exactly why the entire place went quiet without him having to say a word. He wasn't choking up, and he wasn't acting. He was gathering himself, the way someone does when they're about to tell the truth that's been sitting heavy in their chest for far too long. Fans later said they'd never seen him like that. Not in interviews, not in award shows, not in any behind-the-scenes footage. This was George in the most unfiltered way possible. And when he finally lifted his head, it was clear he wasn't delivering a speech. He was speaking straight from somewhere deeper. The surprising thing is that the moment didn't begin with sadness. It began with gratitude, genuine gratitude that seemed to catch him off guard. The cheers had been so loud, so long, and so full of love that he couldn't help but let the emotion hit him. He started talking about how he'd grown up hearing the sound of fans, how those roars became the heartbeat of his entire career, how every time he walked through the curtain and saw those smiling faces, he felt like his feet never touched the ground. But right when people thought he was simply sharing a sweet memory, he shifted. His tone changed. His eyes drifted downward for a second, almost like he was weighing whether he should really say what was on his mind. And that's when the confession began. Not with a dramatic statement, but with a quiet truth that carried more weight than any headline ever could. Because after decades of holding everything together, George Strait was finally ready to admit something he'd never said out loud before. What came next flowed naturally from that moment of vulnerability, as if the emotion itself pushed the words out of him. George didn't try to sugarcoat anything, and he didn't try to make it sound poetic. He simply spoke like a man who'd reached a point in life where honesty mattered more than maintaining an unbreakable image. He said that after all these years on the road, he wasn't sure how many tours he had left in him. Not because he didn't love performing. He made it clear that his love for music was as strong as ever. But because time has its own rules none of us can escape. He quietly admitted that he might only have a handful of good years left to stand on stage the way he always has. And the moment he said it, people felt the air change. Fans who had seen him dozens of times suddenly realized that at some point, maybe sooner than they wanted to imagine, the curtain would fall for the last time. And even though he wasn't announcing any retirement or making some big farewell declaration, his honesty hit harder than anything scripted ever could. But it wasn't just the idea of time running out that shook people. It was the way he talked about why he still gets on stage. George didn't say he does it for legacy or fame or pressure from the industry. He said he does it for the people standing in front of him, for the faces he sees when the lights first come up, for the voices that sing every lyric with him, for the energy that makes him feel 20 years younger every time he steps into that spotlight. And then he said something that brought tears to more than just a few eyes. He told the crowd that when he's finally unable to perform like he used to, he'll still hold every cheer, every roar, every shared moment close for the rest of his life. Those memories, he said, would stay with him long after the music fades. That confession didn't just reveal a fear, it revealed a truth. George Strait wasn't worried about getting older. He was worried about not being able to give everything he's always given to his fans. And that raw honesty created a connection that felt deeper than anything he'd shared before. The reason that moment felt so heavy wasn't simply because George admitted he may be nearing the final stretch of his touring years. It's because everything he said lined up perfectly with the kind of man he's always been: humble, loyal, and deeply tied to the people who helped build his legacy. And as those words echoed through the arena, fans started connecting it to something they had been sensing for years. George Strait has always been about sincerity, not spectacle. Even in interviews spanning decades, he rarely talked about his struggles or doubts. He preferred letting his music speak. Yet here he was, allowing people to see the more fragile side of the man they'd idolized. That's why the confession cut so deep. It wasn't a celebrity trying to create a moment. It was a human being letting others glimpse the weight he carries, the reality of aging, and the quiet fear of someday stepping away from the only life he's ever known. But the deeper meaning went beyond his career. It touched on something universal. Everyone in that arena had their own memories tied to his songs: weddings, heartbreaks, road trips, final goodbyes, moments of joy, moments of pain. When he said he didn't know how much time he had left on stage, people weren't just thinking about George Strait. They were thinking about themselves, about loved ones, about how time sneaks up on all of us without warning. And that created a collective emotion that swept across the crowd. People cried not because he sounded weak, but because he sounded real. He reminded them that legends aren't immune to time, that even the strongest voices eventually soften, that even heroes eventually face the same truths everyone else does. But despite the heaviness of his confession, he didn't let the moment stay sad. Instead, he shifted the energy again, giving just enough hope to lift the room. He talked about how every time he walks out onto that stage, he still feels that same spark he felt as a young man starting out in Texas honky-tonks. And he promised that as long as that spark exists, no matter how many years he has left, he's going to keep giving his whole heart to every show. And just when people thought the emotional roller coaster was settling, George took everyone even deeper. Because the story behind why he sang that specific song that night added another layer nobody expected. The moment flowed naturally into the song he was performing when everything began. "I'll Always Remember You." That alone gave the entire night a second wave of emotional intensity. Because that song isn't just a track on an album. It's a message, a promise, a reminder of all the years he's shared with the people standing in front of him. When George chose that song for that exact show, it wasn't a coincidence. And even though he's performed it many times before, something about this performance felt different. His voice carried a softness, a kind of fragile warmth that made the lyrics feel heavier than usual. Fans could feel it in the way he stretched certain lines, the way his eyes drifted across the crowd like he was memorizing faces, the way he let moments of quiet sit longer than usual. People in the audience later said they felt like he wasn't just singing to the room, he was singing to them personally. And as each verse moved forward, the meaning grew clearer. This wasn't simply a performance. It was a reflection, a look back at an entire lifetime of music, memories, wins, losses, and everything in between. But the real turning point came when he finished the song and stayed quiet for just a heartbeat too long. That pause, that breath, everyone felt it. That's when the confession spilled out. The song had brought him back through 40 years of stages, crowds, and moments he thought he'd never forget. And in that emotional flood, he realized he had to tell the truth he'd been holding on to. What made it even more powerful was that George wasn't saying goodbye. He wasn't ending anything. He was acknowledging the reality that every legend eventually faces, but few ever talk about. And because he spoke honestly, without drama or fear, fans felt closer to him than they ever had before. And little did they know, the emotional ride of that night wasn't even close to over. When that emotional moment settled into the room, something else began to happen. Something George probably didn't expect. A wave of questions immediately swept through the crowd, then onto social media, and eventually across the entire country music world. Because when a legend like him speaks so openly about time, people can't help but wonder what it really means. And that's exactly why, within minutes of the show ending, fans everywhere began asking the same thing. Was George Strait hinting at retirement? It wasn't because he said he was done. He didn't. Not even close. In fact, he made it clear he still loves performing as much as he ever did. But the idea that he might only have a handful of good years left hit people hard. And naturally, that's where speculation took off. Fans started discussing old interviews, past comments, and even things he'd once said about wanting to leave the stage with dignity, rather than staying past his prime. The conversation spread fast, not because people were ready to lose him, but because no one wants to be unprepared when that day finally comes. But the truth is more complicated than a simple yes or no. Behind the scenes, people close to him have said he's still performing with power and energy, still rehearsing with the same discipline he's always had, still talking about future shows and future plans. And some reports even mentioned that the emotional moment was connected more to the song than any farewell message. Even a few insiders stepped in to calm fans, saying that George often shares personal reflections when performing certain songs, and this night just happened to be more emotional than usual. Still, whether he intended it or not, his honesty sparked something larger, a conversation about legacy, about time, and about what it means when the greats begin acknowledging the limits of life. And because people care so deeply for him, those questions were driven not by fear, but by love. They were trying to understand, to prepare, to hold on to him for as long as they can. But what most didn't realize at that moment was that George's confession wasn't just about himself. It pointed towards something deeper, something tied to decades of relationships, memories, and the kind of loyalty that shaped his entire career. And that truth began revealing itself in quiet ways no one expected. The emotional weight of George's confession made people look back at the journey he's traveled, and as they did, another layer of meaning revealed itself. Because George Strait hasn't just spent a lifetime singing songs, he spent it building relationships that shaped country music from the inside out. And when legends think about time, they think about the people who walked beside them through the years. That's why, after the concert, fans immediately began discussing the person who has been intertwined with George's story for decades, Alan Jackson. Rumors, old interviews, and fan discussions resurfaced, suggesting George had recently spoken candidly about their long friendship. Some speculative reports claimed he had opened up about the bond they shared through the highs and lows of their careers. And while none of these claims were confirmed, the very fact that fans connected George's emotional moment to Alan showed how deeply the two artists' legacies are tied together in people's minds. For more than 30 years, George and Alan stood as pillars of the genre. Two men who never chased trends, never relied on flashy stunts, and never compromised the sound that defined them. Theirs was a friendship built on respect, shared values, and the understanding that neither one needed to outshine the other. And as rumors circulated about George reflecting on that bond, fans felt another emotional pull. Because when a legend begins acknowledging time, it makes people think about the relationships that shaped him, the ones that gave him strength, and the ones that helped carry the weight of a long career. But whether those recent stories were factual or not, one thing remained clear. George Strait's legacy isn't just built on the music he made. It's built on the people he lifted up, the artists he inspired, and the way he carried himself through every season of life. And the emotional honesty he showed on that stage was simply another reminder of the kind of man he's always been. Steady, loyal, humble, and grounded. And yet, there was still one more thing the audience felt that night. Something people rarely talk about, but everyone sensed in that room. The shift that happens when a legend stops singing and starts reflecting. What made that night so unforgettable wasn't that it felt like a finale. It wasn't. George never hinted at walking away. He didn't frame it as a goodbye or a farewell tour. Instead, what shook people was the vulnerability, the sudden reminder that even the strongest voices eventually have to reckon with time. And when someone like George Strait, who has spent an entire lifetime being stoic and private, lets his guard down, people feel it in a way that goes far beyond music. The audience didn't cry because they believed he was disappearing. They cried because, for the first time, he spoke openly about something everyone knew deep down, but never wanted to confront. They cried because they realized he's human, just like the rest of us, and that even legends carry quiet fears. They cried because he gave them a rare moment of truth, one that made everything they loved about him feel even more precious. And tied into all of this was something even more profound, the understanding that George Strait has never been driven by the spotlight. He's never needed attention, drama, or headlines. He built a 50-year career by being consistent, honest, and deeply connected to the people who supported him. So when he admitted he wasn't sure how many years he had left on stage, it didn't come from insecurity. It came from love. Love for the crowd. Love for the craft. Love for the life he built around lyrics and stories and moments just like this one. That's why the confession hit everyone so deeply. It wasn't about the end. It was about the meaning. Meaning in every show he's ever performed, in every fan he's ever met, in every memory created in arenas and stadiums across decades. George reminded everyone that music isn't just something he performs, it's something he shares. And someday, those shared moments will become memories that live on long after he steps out of the spotlight. But before the night closed, he gave them one final message, a message that tied every emotional thread together and left fans with something they'll carry forever. As the applause settled and the night reached its final moments, George did something simple, yet unforgettable. He stepped toward the microphone with that same quiet steadiness he's always had, looked out at the sea of faces, and thanked them. Not with a flashy speech, not with some perfectly polished monologue, but with the kind of gratitude that comes from deep inside a person who knows exactly how rare it is to be loved for this long. He told the crowd that no matter how many years he has left, he'll keep giving them everything he has. He reminded them that every cheer, every smile, every moment of connection over the past 4 decades has meant more to him than he could ever express. And then came the line that no one in that arena will ever forget. "I'll always remember you." Not as a lyric, not as a performance, but as a promise. It was a reminder that while time might eventually slow him down, it will never erase the bond he's built with the people who supported him from the very beginning. It will never erase the stories he's told through his music, or the way those stories made fans feel seen, understood, and connected. And it will never erase the truth he shared that night, that the memories they created together matter to him just as much as they matter to them. As people walked out of the arena, wiping their eyes and replaying his words in their minds, one thing became clear. George Strait's confession wasn't about losing time. It was about honoring it, cherishing it, acknowledging how deeply he values every person who ever stood in front of him while he sang. And in the end, that's why the moment will stay with fans forever. Because when a legend speaks from the heart, the world listens. And when George Strait opened up that night, he didn't just leave fans in tears. He reminded them why he'll always be remembered, long after the final note fades.